Today's lesson is on valence electrons. So we've already talked about the 3 subatomic particles in an atom, and one of those are the electrons. But today we're going to talk about special kinds of electrons, and those are the valence electrons. So just to review, electrons are the negative subatomic particle found moving outside the nucleus. They are shown in green in this diagram. Electrons move in a circular path around the nucleus on objects called energy shells. Those energy shells can also be called energy levels, orbitals, or the whole region can be called the electron cloud. So let's talk about what valence electrons are. Valence electrons are the electrons in the outer energy level or outer energy shell of an atom. These are the electrons that are transferred or shared when atoms bond together to make new substances. So for example, when we are mixing hydrogen and oxygen together to make water, those electrons are shared or transferred, and hydrogen and oxygen are bonding together. But when they bond, they're only using the outside electrons, and those outside electrons are called valence electrons. So a question is, how do you find out the number of valence electrons when looking at a Bohr model? So we've been practicing over and over how to draw Bohr models. And as you can see, there's already an example of a Bohr model up on the display. And you can see that this Bohr model has 7 protons, 7 neutrons, and 7 electrons. So this is nitrogen. And where I've already pointed out that this here, this outer energy level here is the outer shell, and valence electrons are the electrons found on the very outside outer shell. So all of these here that are circled are your valence electrons. So valence electrons are not the total number of electrons, but only the electrons that are found on the very outside energy shell. So for this model, for nitrogen has 5 valence electrons. There are 5 electrons on the very outermost shell. Now, depending on the atom, the outermost shell could be the first energy level, it might be the second energy level, or if it's a very large atom, it might be the third energy level. So depending on the atom, you just have to look at whichever level is on the very outside. Another way to find valence electrons is by looking at the periodic table. And using the periodic table is easier because then you don't have to necessarily draw the Bohr model for the atom to find the valence electrons. So, how do you find the valence electrons without looking at a Bohr model? If you take a look at the periodic table, okay, that you have in front of you, it'll be a little bit easier to see. Pick it up and take a look very carefully at the numbers that are across the tops of each column. So do that now. You might notice that they're all numbered. So if you're looking here, okay, I've pointed out they're very lightly circled in red, that at the top of each column on your periodic table there is a number. That number tells you the number of valence electrons that are found in all of these elements in the entire column. So let's take the first column for example. The first column that has hydrogen at the top has a little 1 here, right at the top. That 1 tells us that everybody in this whole column has 1 valence electron. So really all you have to do is find your element, go to the top of the column, look at the number, and the number tells you how many valence electrons there are. So let's take an example such as phosphorus. Phosphorus is over here. Its symbol is a capital P. If you go to the top of the column for phosphorus and look at the number, you see that it's a 15. Now for these double-digit numbers that are found over here, okay, we know that we don't have 15 electrons on an energy level because they don't hold that much. So the clue is if your number at the top of the group is 15, you only look at the ones place. Okay, so Phosphorus's group number is 15, so that means it has 5 valence electrons. So to help you understand this, let's look at this picture of the periodic table, okay? And you can look at yours also. So these vertical columns are called groups or families, and they are numbered straight across. Group 1, Group 2. We're going to skip this region in here for a second. Group 3, Group 4, Group 5, Group 6, Group 7, and Group 8. Okay, so again, the group number will tell us how many valence electrons there are. However, like I mentioned on the previous slide, these group numbers here, they might say 3 and a capital letter, but they also might say, and it says on yours, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. So now you know that if you see a double-digit number at the top of your group or the top of your column, to find the number of valence electrons, you simply look at only the ones place. So each element in a group, so let's take this group for example, okay? This is the noble gases, which is number 18 on your periodic table, but again, we just look at the ones place and it's an 8. They all have the same number of valence electrons in this whole group. So everybody in this group will all have 8 valence electrons. Okay, so we said that we use valence electrons when atoms bond together, when they're making new substances. And it makes sense because if you look at this diagram here, we have 2 separate atoms. We have sodium over here, and we have chlorine over here. So separately, it's 1 atom of sodium and 1 atom of chlorine. However, when they bond together, you get a substance called sodium chloride. And some of you might know that that's table salt. That's the salt that you put on your food. But in order for them to bond together to make sodium chloride, they have to share electrons. Okay, and when they share electrons, they're only going to share the electrons in their outermost shell, and those electrons are the valence electrons. So what happens when sodium and chlorine come together, 1 valence electron will come from sodium and go over to chlorine. Okay, so sodium is in group 1, and if you look on your periodic table, it's on the far left side. Group 1 will mean that it only has 1 valence electron, and here it is. However, chlorine, which is found on the right-hand side of your periodic table, it's Cl, it's in group 17, or 7a, which if you take a look, you only look at the ones place, that means that chlorine has 7 valence electrons. So sodium is going to give up its 1 to chlorine. So if I were to ask you to determine the number of valence electrons for an atom, here's what you would do. You have a couple options. You can use the periodic table to help you, or you could draw a Bohr model. So if I said, please find the number of valence electrons for carbon, you could draw the Bohr model, and here it is. Okay, so carbon, we didn't put all the little particles in the nucleus, okay, because we've done carbon before. But here are carbon's electrons. Carbon has 6 total electrons, 2 on the first energy level and 4 on the second energy level, for a total of 6. And if you look, that means that this is the outermost energy level. This is the outer shell, which means those are the valence electrons. So carbon has 4 valence electrons. But now I would like you to find carbon on your periodic tables. If you look, carbon is in group 14 or 4, which means carbon has 4 valence electrons. So there's 2 ways you can find it out. You can go ahead and draw the Bohr model and look at the valence electrons in the outer shell, or you can use the periodic table and use the group number as a hint. So here's some practice ones. Okay, so you can do them together as a class, or you can choose to write them in your binder. Here's the first example. I would like you to name the element, tell me how many total electrons, but then tell me how many valence electrons this element has. This is neon. Neon has 10 total electrons. Okay, and remember, you can also find electrons by looking at the atomic number. The atomic number is the same as the number of protons and the same as the number of electrons. So neon has 10 electrons, but it's in group 18 or 8, which means it has 8 valence electrons. So 8 of those electrons are in the outer shell. Okay, 2 are on the first shell, but 8 are on the outside, which means it has 8 valence electrons. Try this one. This is H. This is a little bit easier because it's a smaller atom. This is hydrogen. Hydrogen has an atomic number of 1, so it only has 1 electron, which means that this is the outer shell, so hydrogen has 1 valence electron. And you also know that because hydrogen is in group 1. This is helium. Helium has 2 electrons. Its atomic number is 2. And also, since it only has 2, it's only using that first energy shell, which means it only has 2 valence electrons. Helium is special, and there's something you need to remember about helium. Helium, if you look on your periodic tables, please check. Helium is in group 8A or 18, which if you think about the hint that I just told you, that technically means, that all of those in that group have 8 valence electrons. But look at how small helium is. It does not have 8. So why is it in that group? Think about that. Okay? Since helium just has 1 shell, that shell can only fit 2 electrons. It's not using any of the larger shells that can hold 8. So helium is still in that group, group 18, because all of the elements in that group have a full outer shell. It's just that helium's outer shell is a little bit smaller than the rest. And the elements in the group with those full outer shells, group 18, are also known as the noble gases. And we'll talk about in a little bit why a full outer shell is something that all atoms want. So just to review, valence electrons are the electrons only on the outer energy shell or outer energy level of an atom. Okay, and these are important because these are the electrons that are used when atoms bond together to make new substances.